Welcome to the YouTube channel on poverty and culture. Our channel is dedicated to understanding how culture affects poverty and other social problems. Through discussions with our guests, we hope to understand that connection more deeply and thus find better answers. Our host is Larry Mead, a longtime scholar of poverty and welfare reform and the author of the recent Burdens of Freedom. Our initial ideas about culture come from this book, but the discussion may take us in new directions. Peter Schuck is the Baldwin Professor of Law Emeritus at Yale University.
Okay, my thanks to our audience for being with us. I'm Larry Mead from New York University. I'm just going to give a brief summary of the idea of cultural difference that we'll be talking about. By culture, we really mean what people think life's about. What is it that people try to do and be during their lives? It turns out there's a lot of variation about this around the world. And the great fact about America is that it's culturally divided. We tend to think that we are in some way unified, but that really isn't true. The dominant culture is an individualist culture that came from Europe. I'll say more about that in a moment. But meanwhile, we have a number of groups in the society whom we typically think of as racial minorities: Blacks, Hispanics, Native Americans. These groups came from outside the Western world, not from Europe, and that gives them a rather different view of what life's about. The contrast is roughly between an individualist viewpoint and a more cautious viewpoint characteristic of the non-West. In the Western world, people typically pursue their own goals that they've chosen. And at the same time, they have moralistic attitudes about right and wrong, which restrict what they can do. They should do the right thing as well as pursuing their own goals. The non-Western groups, on the other hand, tend to be more likely to adjust to outside pressures rather than seeking to change the world. So they're more cautious. And their idea of morals is much more based on context and situation. They respond to the demands and expectations of other people rather than having abstract ideas. So these are the general contrasts. And they create opportunity for America in that it creates a more diverse society. But on the other hand, it complicates the effort to integrate the society because people begin from very different places. And a lot of our social problems, we think, have to do with this cultural difference. So I'm going to stop there and ask for Peter's reaction.
Okay, well, first let me congratulate you on a very ambitious, extraordinarily sweeping theory and effort to support it. This is a really stimulating read. I want to make a couple of introductory criticisms in terms of the context before turning to your substantive points. First, you say that very early in the, maybe even in the intro, that your book is the first to emphasize culture in general and individualism as primary in shaping behavior. I don't think that's true. I mean, I'm not a student of this particular literature, but James Hugh Wilson certainly made that argument long ago in an article, I think, in the Atlantic, and it's probably in one of his books in a more expansive fashion. And Thomas Sowell, whose book, Migrations in Culture, I reviewed at great length in the Michigan Law Review, and I thought it was a superb book, and one that I hope you have read and will continue to teach in your class. It's very, very stimulating and full of fascinating information. And there are others. So it's not entirely clear to me what the basis for your claim, for that claim is. It's not all that important either, because the question is whether the argument is coherent and valuable, not who made it first. So that brings me to the definition of culture, which you just advanced, and I think it's very important to recognize how ambiguous the notion of culture is. It's extraordinarily ambiguous. Lots of things are. Most important ideas, I suppose, are ambiguous. But culture is perhaps the one that can be disputed endlessly as to what it includes, what it entails, and the other aspect of this difficulty is that it's impossible to reach a firm conclusion about culture, its measurements, its composition, its distribution among countries and societies, and so forth, precisely because of its ambiguity and because of our inability to identify precisely what constitutes it and what it does and does not explain. So I'm let me give you a couple of examples drawn from your book. One point that is interesting, and I don't think you discussed this, but it's been pointed out that culture is a public good, and what that means is that once provided, it is available to everybody, the benefits and the demerits of it. And so what requires explanation is how it arises in the first place, how it's created, generated, and then sustained. And I suppose your answer will be, well, it's just there at any particular point in time. You've attempted to explain its sources and how it arises, but for most people, it's just there, and so you'd have to. One of the implications is that you have a lot of everybody has an incentive to ride free without contributing to the maintenance and enrichment of that culture, and so if that incentive is important, then it applies to almost everybody in the society, and so that means that the fuel for culture will be exhausted or unavailable in the first place. So I guess at some point I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, let me respond to a couple of these points. The question of whether others have spoken of culture, I think they certainly have, and I would never say otherwise. But I'm not aware of another author who has spoken and emphasized this general contrast between the West and the non-West. Really, that hasn't happened in my experience. You mentioned Tom Sowell. Sowell speaks of culture, but he doesn't frame the issue in these terms. And most of the contrasts that he draws between groups are in terms of social capital. That is, the groups that do best in America are those that have the most education. So he's using a very orthodox economic concept about social capital that isn't really about culture in my sense. I used to be very persuaded by Sowell, and then I realized that he really isn't addressing the fundamental difference that we face in the society. We haven't found, for example, that simply to increase education removes or eliminates the differences in functioning we find amongst the various non-Western groups. They do better in the sense that their skills increase, but their way of life is still very distinctive it's very different from that of the mainstream. As far as the ambiguity of culture, I certainly agree that it is an ambiguous term, but I also know that there is a large literature which I've been drawn upon by scholars of cultural differences who have agreed pretty much about the terms. And they make very much the same generalizations about groups and countries that I do. Indeed, that's the basis of my book. So there is clearly a tradition in which the term is seen as meaningful, even though, of course, it does have to be defined. Well, that's one comment about a public good. I do agree with you about that every culture has a dimension that has to do with the maintenance of public order, public institutions, and there is always a temptation to free ride. That's certainly true in Western countries where what maintains the institutions is the moralism of the culture, the willingness to criticize shortcomings, to keep government on its mettle, and people who don't do that are free riding on the culture. That is true, but it's also true in the non-West. There, the forces that maintain order are more collective. They more confined to immediate groups. But there too, you have an order maintenance problem. So I think this is a general problem with culture. I agree with you, but I don't think it really differentiates the West and the non-West.
I don't think I'm convinced, having read the book, that you're entirely aware of the difficulty of defining culture and measuring it and then comparing it among different groups. You say that many times in the book, but it leaves the problem, and this was my point. It leaves the problem that this basic and irreducible ambiguity in the term creates a temptation for people to use it in ways that seek to answer questions where the proof isn't otherwise convincing. It's kind of a make-weight. It's an available make-weight argument, and it can be used and is used prolifically, and I think to some with some risk. Indeed, I think much of the argument about poverty, and you have a whole chapter on it, and Black Lives Matter and relationships among whites and blacks and other ethnic groups in our society has danced around the idea of culture, and that's partly because culture is so useful in filling in blank spaces in our understanding of important things, and it's partly because people haven't thought very hard about what the root causes of problems are. So culture is a space filler, convenient space filler.
Yeah, I agree with you that culture is often a residual category, the thing we appeal to when we don't find other explanations that are more concrete. I think that's true. And I have noticed a trend in debate about poverty among experts towards culture because other factors are less and less persuasive than they were decades ago. So it's harder today to explain poverty, especially long-term poverty, among people who it would seem could escape poverty. The inability to explain that in terms of concrete factors like racial bias, lack of jobs, lack of skills, childcare, various barriers have been imagined and researched. And yet none of them really explain why we have long-term poverty. And in the groups that I've recently been part of, where we wrestled with how to deal with poverty, it was my sense that the experts had basically given up. There wasn't any serious debate now about the cause of poverty. There is debate, but it's mostly about policy, about the things that we should do. There's definitely disagreement, and that's come out recently in Washington. So it's not as if the experts are agreed, but the thing they don't much talk about is how it arises, how we have long-term poverty in the world's richest country. And it seems to me that because of the history of research that has now not found an answer, that a cultural explanation becomes more persuasive than if we had a tradition of findings that really told us what's going on here. I mean, what strikes me about the cultural approach is that it captures what is to me an essential feature of the long-term poor, and that is their passivity, their reactive nature, the fact that they are waiting for the world to change in some way before they can move on with their lives. And what they don't do typically is take action on their own behalf. They don't proceed from the inside out, rather than react to the outside world. And that difference is what makes them different from mainstream society.
Well, then we perhaps should move to another dimension of your book, which is the attribution of different cultures, even within discrete societies. So you say about the U.S., blacks have non-Western tendencies because most of them descend from Africa, and for that reason they're more collectivist. It seems to me that's rather hard to sustain. I completely agree that there is a culture within Black communities, so largely black communities, that is distinctive. But the idea that having been here for over 400 years, they are still sort of the cultural captives of Africa seems to me to be a very strange claim, and one that's, I think, impossible to verify.
Well, that's something a number of people have questioned. You're not alone in that. And my response has been that it isn't just that most blacks came from Africa, which is indeed a very collective-minded, non-individualist culture, and it still is today. It's not just that, but the fact that they lived under slavery for a prolonged period, and then for another period under Jim Crow. And therefore, the encounter between blacks and individuals in America didn't really happen until the group moved north from the southern areas where it had been concentrated to the northern cities where they encountered an individualist culture. And for the first time, they had to compete for prominence, which they didn't before. There was really no opportunity for them in the South. They came north now, there is opportunity, but it's competitive. That's not something that's part of their original culture, way of understanding. And also the moral assumptions of the North are moralistic. The people are supposed to know how to behave and do the right thing, like obeying the law. And that isn't something that was really required in the South because the Southerners impose an external authority structure on blacks because that's what allowed them to keep control of the group.
Well, let me intervene. Yeah, let me intervene just to focus on this very question. Okay, if it's not 400 years, it's 100 years that blacks have been in northern communities where the cultural patterns that you described prevail. It seems to me just implausible that they would be unable to imbibe and internalize and exploit the cultural patterns that you're ascribing to northern whites, so it's just a very, very complicated picture. And the other fact I wanted to throw out, because it again complicates your argument, is the vast differences in behaviors and well, let me just leave it at behaviors because we don't know exactly what causes those behaviors. That's part of my point. Within the United States, so you have this this continental society to which you ascribe certain attributes, most of which are very advantageous, but there are so many exceptions, so many deviations from that that I don't know. I'm not clear of what you make of them. Whether you fully acknowledge them, or if you do, how that affects the generalizations you make about the United States.
Well, now you mentioned various groups. Obviously, there are differences within the groups with a primarily European background. That is certainly true, and that's a point that Sol makes. Also, Glaser and Moynihan make in their.
I meant to include that.
Well, there are differences, obviously, and there are also differences among the non-Western groups, with Asians, for example, distinct from blacks, and so on. So I'm not saying those aren't important, but the great fact is that the earlier immigrant groups came to America and assimilated quickly, primarily because they were coming from Europe. They already had much of an individual's culture in their background. So they knew when they came here that America was a project. It wasn't simply a condition. You weren't just going to be better off here. You had to do something to realize the opportunities. And they had various struggles to do that. And it wasn't easy. And they weren't necessarily fairly treated, but they nevertheless progressed. And that's what we don't see for the heavily non-Western groups, and not in the same way. Asians are a little bit different because they've avoided the serious social problems that blacks and Hispanics have. Blacks and Hispanics, you see some assimilation. Certainly, there is a black middle class, which I emphasize in my treatment. But what makes them different is precisely because they've taken on board the burdens of freedom. They are individuals.
Well, the very
why they've been able to succeed. But the bulk of the group is still struggling. And that isn't a long time. If we say it's 100 years, well, according to studies that are mostly about European groups, full assimilation takes something like 3 generations. So it isn't at all unusual that there should be a large group of blacks who are still engaging in survival. Life for them is about survival. It is not about pursuing a goal. And that is the fundamental change that they have to make. And our most successful programs are those that, in fact, press them to make that change, to take on board the civilities that they have to accept, but at the same time, to then have the freedom to pursue their own lives. So freedom depends upon an orderly assimilation of values about how one is supposed to behave, followed by the opportunities that America makes possible. So it is very hard to do. I mean, I came away from writing this book with even greater admiration before at what blacks have done in becoming as assimilated as they are. And I've many black associates and friends who are just like me or you. They're overcommitted, committed individualists who are seeking to achieve personal goals. They're obligated by their own goals more than by anything else. And they live lives of purpose, but not lives of freedom in the sense that they're carefree. On the contrary, their lives are bound up in their responsibilities. And that's true for black individuals too. And that's what makes them full members of the society. But the Baldwin group is still engaging in survival, and that is their main problem. And we have to recognize that there isn't some barrier out there that we can find that is going to liberate them. Because in a sense, they're too liberated. I mean, I make the case in the book that actually the reason why black society collapses in the 60s and 70s is because they no longer had a source of order. They had escaped the external authority of the South, but they hadn't yet taken on board the internalized authority of the individual's culture. So for that period, there's chaos in the inner city. I can remember those years, and there really was chaos. But then society imposes an external authority in the form of tougher law enforcement, tougher welfare policies, tougher school policies. In all those areas, we return to somewhat greater order. But we still have to make sure that those who are trying to join the mainstream will in fact take on board those values. So they won't require the same external suasions which they have known historically. And that is the great drama. And there is success. There are people who are moving ahead, who are getting ahead, but we have a problem with the majority, which again are still they're oppressed, not so much because society is oppressive, but society has expectations which they have to fulfill and which any successful person has to fulfill. So as the veterans say, freedom isn't free. Freedom requires the acceptance of external and internalized obligations, especially internal. And that, I think, is what's distinctive this point of view. And I think we should resist the idea that blacks are a special case because the Hispanic story is so similar. It is really very parallel to the black story. And of course, Hispanics were never enslaved. They haven't been fairly treated. They suffered discrimination, adversity of various kinds. No question about that. But their story is very similar. Their problem is to maintain order in their personal lives after they come to America. It's after they come here that order becomes a problem for them. Whereas it wasn't in the old country where there was a lot more external pressure about how to behave. Come here and that pressure isn't present. You have to tell yourself how to behave. And that's hard for Hispanics as it is for blacks. So this is a real change.
Yeah. Can you expand on the claim you made? Let's see. I don't have the page number, but it's toward the end, in which you say cultural differences between immigrants and the United States have never been greater.
Yes.
That seems to me to be very dubious.
Well,
let me just, given the extraordinary economic success, family stability, and increasing political integration of many immigrant groups, a lot of variation among them, to be sure, but groups that come from the areas that you call collectivist societies. So it seems to me that the differences are actually narrowing and in some cases almost to the vanishing point.
Yeah. Well, I'm making that statement. I think it's in connection with research by Big Door, an economist at Duke. He's got an index of assimilation that he's developed using various indicators. And in that, he, without going into the technology of it, he basically finds that assimilation is much weaker today than it was 100 years ago. Because back then, the immigrants coming in from Europe, particularly Eastern and Southern Europe, were more skilled relative to the mainstream than they are today. And they simply were closer to mainstream America when they entered. Whereas today, the gap is much wider. The skills gap is larger. The way of life is very different. The problems that the groups have, especially in criminal justice, are much greater than they were before. And there's definitely something different about Hispanics and Blacks, and to a lesser extent, Asians. They are not as immediately compatible with the American way of life as the groups that we remember from 100 years ago. And that's because they're not coming from Europe. It's pretty simple. And doesn't mean they have an easy time. They have, in fact, a tougher time, I would say, in some ways, than they did back then. Back then, we did a lot less to help them than we do now.
Well, there was just a footnote here. There was an Americanization movement during the earlier surge, in which attempted to help them through cultural coercion, if you will.
That's true. In fact,
we don't have much of that today.
There's an irony. My good friend and colleague Martin Shane is an expert on those changes, and what he says, and it's absolutely true, is that back then there was a lot more prejudice against immigrants. There was more belief that they were somehow distinct and mainstream, and the way people wrote about immigrants back then is horrifying to read today. It's very definitely an intolerant society towards these newcomers, and yet, in fact, they assimilated quickly. What's happening today is the opposite. We have, in fact, a much greater cultural difference to deal with, and assimilation is more difficult. But society is unready to talk about it. Far from being critical, we now tend to make what I call the sameness assumption, that everyone is alike, and it makes no difference where you came from. You can come from Asia, from Africa, from Latin America, doesn't matter. You just cross the border and immediately you're fully a credentialed American and you behave like everybody else. Well, that just isn't true. That's a myth. And we have to be more candid about the assimilation problems we face today, which are really much more serious. And I'm not saying we should give up. I do think we should reduce immigration. We should limit demand on the system for people coming in, especially on the schools. They have really been overwhelmed by the Hispanic influx. And that is a reason why the public schools in most of the big cities are almost entirely dominated by Black and Hispanic students. And they pose special problems. They are trying to take on board an entire way of life, which is not where they came from.
Okay. It's hard to, I'm not clear what your explanation was for the fact that China and Japan are very rich, but they're not individualistic.
No.
That may be more comment on how wealth, the various ways in which wealth can be created, than it is about your claims about cultural patterns.
Yeah. The Asian cases I give a lot of prominence to because, in one sense, they appear to question the idea that individualist America has some special secret for becoming rich and powerful. Clearly, that's not true. The Asians have found another way to become rich and powerful, and it's by relying upon their collective ethos, their collective identity, where people really don't think of themselves as separate from the mainstream, and people are highly deferential to authority. And a society like that, when the goals are clear, when it knows what it has to do, can be very formidable. China right now is a great force that's becoming rich and powerful, no question. Japan was an even more remarkable force in the late 19th and up through the middle of the 20th century. Japan changed the world in a way that was just unimaginable to Europeans at the time. So there is clearly another way to become rich and powerful. But they didn't do it by becoming individuals like America. On the contrary, they did it with this collective ethos. And this means that their society have very different strengths and weaknesses from ours. They are able to achieve an overall unity and commitment to a goal. And if that's what it takes to get rich and you know what you have to do, then indeed China or Japan are very formidable. But what they don't have is the capacity to innovate and also the capacity to draw upon initiative from every level of the society. What's really remarkable about the United States and to a lesser extent other Western countries is the dynamism of it, the fact that the willingness to solve problems, take on board problems, and find solutions is found up and down the society, not simply in the leadership. And many people take it on themselves to solve problems without waiting for direction. And in the great collective enterprises that Americans face, I'm thinking especially of World War I, World War II, the Cold War, and so on. In those areas, there was leadership, to be sure. Leadership is important. But above all, many Americans took it on themselves to solve problems. And it was that initiative which was finally overwhelming for our adversaries. They simply couldn't compete with us. Japan found that out. Japan was unable to deal not just with American productivity and wealth, which they knew was greater than theirs, but because our leadership was so broadly based that we were able to solve problems in a way that the Japanese couldn't do. The Japanese were willing to die for the emperor, but they weren't willing to think new thoughts. That wasn't part of their culture. And it still isn't today. Japan is very efficient society, very good at translating Western technology into new products and so on. It's a very well-run society. Japan is actually unusual in Asia in how well governed it is. And that I praise that. And you have to ask how they were able to do it with a strongly individualist culture. Well, Japan has special features that really aren't found in any other society. So they are, in some ways, misleading about the capacity of Asia to govern itself. In fact, mostly Asian government is weak because it's corrupt, because it's inefficient, because you don't find accountability for the leadership. That's certainly true in China. China's biggest problem today is how to become more efficient as they become more powerful. And indeed, they're facing a real crisis there. I mean, I say in the last chapter that there is some evidence that the culture is changing in China, where the elite is interested in greater freedom, and that also means taking on the burdens of freedom. And that's a threat to the regime, because the minute you start broadening political participation, then you have a really hard time reconciling freedom with order. And you see, this is what the West can do. The West can do that because our psychology combines inner-driven qualities with moralistic qualities about good behavior. So we can create and sustain a civic culture. Well, really, nobody in Asia has that. Japan has it in a way because it's so strongly collective. But in general, Asia doesn't have civility. That is not a value in the culture. And that means they really have to choose between freedom and order. They can't have both. And China right now is very definitely emphasizing order against freedom. And I think they're going to have a hard time competing with the United States down the way because we are able to be creative and at the same time preserve order. That is the mystery that I think Asia really doesn't understand.
Let me ask you. There isn't much in the book about this, though. At some point, you talk about the neglected values in the West, which were. I was not convinced that they are real characteristics of the West, especially when the West is defined as broadly as you have them. The contemplation of reality for its own sake, aesthetic sensibility, weak sense of community. I think I quite disagree with you on that. We can come back to that. And coping with tragedy. Yeah. I don't know how we measure something like that, especially across culture.
All I can say is that it's a strong element. Sorry, Peter, go ahead. Right.
So let me. My question is, well, two questions. One has to do with the source of your insistence that we have a weak sense of community, given the extraordinary nonprofit sector, informal sector, in the United States, which was, observed, 200 years ago by Tocqueville, and has really flourished since then with ups and downs, but with enormous power. And then, secondly, how do you think the United States culture is changing in ways that might affect your normative claims about the differences?
You're absolutely right about the nonprofit community, which is vast and impressive. My explanation for that is pretty simple. It reflects the moralism of the culture, the insistence that Americans feel to do the right thing and to help others that are less fortunate is really quite strong. And that is still the case today. I was discovered in my research that the urge to save the outside world goes back to 1806, when the U.S. was a barely new country. And yet there were American elites even then who said it was their responsibility to go forth and save the world. My grandfather was one of those who heard that claim and went off and became a missionary in China. And I know people today that are missionaries. So that is where that nonprofit sector comes from. It has problems too. It isn't in every way serving the public interest. It isn't. It's self-chosen and self-motivated. But there's no denying that it's very, very strong and important. And that element is underemphasized in the way we appreciate individualism. We tend to say individualists are self-centered, that they're out for themselves. They just want to make money. And that's all true. That is also part of the temperament. But meanwhile, there's this voice inside our heads that says that we must care about the less fortunate. And that goes back to our religious traditions, and it keeps us from being entirely self-centered. And therefore, we're able to do what we do. Now, but having said that, it is still true that the society is less collective-minded than what you find in the non-Western world. And that's simply because even when they're at their most moralistic, individualists remain individuals, and they think of themselves as separate from the group. Whereas in the non-West, the group is primary, and people often don't think of themselves as separate. So that makes it easier for the group to pull together when there's some tremendous catastrophe. And that's one of the reasons why the non-West, I think, is more able to deal with tragedy, with limitation, with the hard things that cannot be managed. I mean, it's a culture of mastery. That is basically what the West is about. It's what it cares most about. But there are things that cannot be mastered. I think we've seen that recently with the coronavirus. That was something that, for the first time in a long time, presented us with a challenge that we couldn't really solve immediately. We had to struggle with it, and struggle with a challenge that we don't have an answer to. That really is not a dominant Western experience. Our history has been too fortunate. We've tended to overcome our problems, and we don't have, therefore, the same fatalistic view of life that you find in much of the non-West. So I do see that as a weakness of the West. It's something we're not good at. Indeed, there are a number of things we're not good at. I therefore don't think there's any general claim that the Western culture is superior to the non-West. On the contrary, it has strengths and weaknesses, things we're good at, things we're not good at. And that's true for the non-West as well. So there's no idea here that a cultural perspective is a way of dismissing some part of the world or some part of the American experience. I don't want to do that because we do need to become more diverse in the way we look at life. And that's one thing the non-West can contribute. I do, however, worry about the scale of immigration, especially because if there is a risk that it will simply turn the country into a non-Western country, and thereby we will lose the distinctive attributes that we get from individualist culture.
Well, let me interrupt on that, and then I would like to go back to the question about how you think the United States itself is changing.
Oh, okay, yeah.
On this
well, I think it's changing. Yeah, go ahead.
With immigrants, it requires often unimaginable initiative to leave one's home, regardless of the conditions at home, and travel to another country where life is much harder in some respects, where far from your roots, far from your family, and so forth. now I'm not romanticizing immigration, but I am questioning whether, and this may be a self-selection process. And one answer you could give is that it's a self-selection process. The people who immigrate are the most individualistic, Western type people from their countries. Maybe I'm sure that's true, and maybe that fully explains it. But I find it hard to accept the fact that you seem to feel that immigrants bring with them the collectivism of their country of origin.
You see, if that were true, then the countries they're coming from would be very different from what they are. I don't think selection is very strong today. It's too easy to get to America. We're seeing that currently on the southern border, where thousands of people are simply crossing the border and claiming asylum without any deeply laid plans about their lives. They're not coming to America, it seems to me, to enjoy a life of freedom. They're coming for survival. This is part of their script as a non-Western person, non-Western culture. What you do is you experience life as oppressive, but the forces are outside. And they are indeed oppressive, no question about it. People coming from Central America are fleeing lives of chaos. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But that doesn't mean that they're highly selected for America. It doesn't mean that they come here to be free in the classic sense that was true 100 years ago or 200 years ago. No, they're coming here to survive. And we don't see that the immigrants coming in large numbers from Asia and many from Asia or Latin America are in fact doing well once they get here. On the contrary, they have a really hard time adjusting. And their children have a hard time adjusting. They don't show the same steady progress towards the middle class that was the case for the immigrants of 100 years ago. And that's because their motivation is rather different. Now, what my concern is that element is going to strengthen, and eventually America will become rather like Brazil or Mexico, will become a society that's multicultural, but where most of the cultures are really not dedicated to the ambitious kind of goals that defined the country originally. I mean, if you want to talk about selection, you have to look well further back when it was much harder and more dangerous to come to America. I mean, in the 17th century, the people who jumped on sailing ships to come to America were engaging in absolutely crazy behavior. There's no way to call that a rational way of life, but they had a purpose and a mission. And these are the people that founded the country we have, and they were very, very strongly individualists. These are people who weren't going to take no for an answer. They had a goal, and they'd do anything to achieve it, and they died achieving it. And that was the temperament, I think, right up until the later 19th century, when conditions for coming to America got a whole lot easier, and where you could come to America simply because it was a better place to live, and it didn't require any great change from what you knew in Europe. Europe was already a Western society, and the countries in which people came from then are rich and very much like America today. That's why there was very little reason to doubt that the people coming then were going to assimilate, whereas today, the countries people are coming from are a long way from being developed in a Western sense, and where there's a misgovernment and so on and so on, and that it gives people a reason to move, but it doesn't give them a reason to become individualists. That's rather different. They're not asking for that. They're asking for survival, and some of them should get it, but we cannot deal with the numbers who want to come to the West. There are millions, indeed billions of people in the world who would like to escape crumbling developing countries and come to the West, and that breakdown is overwhelmingly to be seen in cultural terms. And I mean, that's in some ways the great tragedy of the world today is that the non-West has not been able to construct a viable political order in the way that the West has done. And that is, to me, a great tragedy. I mean, when I was going through graduate school in the 70s, 60s, 70s, in that time, it was assumed that non-Western countries, many of which have been colonies of the West, were going to become more or less similar to the West. They were going to become steadily richer, steadily better governed, and they would approximate to a Western norm over a period of years. But that basically hasn't happened. there's been a growth in wealth, and the world in general is wealthier than it's ever been before. But governance has not improved in most of these countries. On the contrary, it's falling apart. That, I think, dramatizes the essential difference between the West and the non-West, which is really all about culture. And the West has this magic capacity to combine order and freedom. But it takes a certain psychology to do it. And if you don't have that, when you come to America seeking merely survival, you don't find an easy time. On the contrary, you have quite a difficult time.
Well, I think you're moving to one side the extraordinary performance of Asian immigrants, particularly the Japanese and Indians, South Asia, and the Chinese in the United States. It seems to me their behavior is more consistent with an embrace of the values that you consider Western than it is with simply trying to survive. Obviously, these are generalizations. There are many exceptions within each of these groups. We both understand that. Yeah. But the massive success of these groups is a striking challenge, I think, for your dichotomy.
The South Asians are not typical of their home society. They are highly selective. I have friends that I met in graduate school from India who were very much like me. They came from elite backgrounds. They were already well educated before they came to America. And that's the group that's done exceptionally well. There's no question about it. They are a huge asset to the country. But they're not typical of India. Far from it.
Where did they acquire their values? If not from the society.
In the cases I know personally, they came from highly Anglified families that had been educated in the West and served careers in the Indian system, which was created by the British. They were fully assimilated to that before they ever came to America. But that isn't typical of India. On the contrary, most of India is a strongly non-Western country, engaging in a way of life very, very far from what happens in the West today. Now, the East Asians are different. They have generally not been as spectacularly successful, but they're also less selected. They're coming here from families that often have a basis in the United States, and they bring further families here. These students show up in my classes, and what I find about them, and others say the same, is that they do very well as long as they're in school, because school provides a structured existence where they're told what they have to do. And then after that, when they get to college and afterwards, they have a much harder time because then they have to make their own initiatives. They have to make their own arguments. They have to take risks. They have to leave the family, all of which is hard for anybody in the non-West. And that means that they then have a much harder time. I cite some evidence to this effect, and there was a recent article in The Economist about a study that was explicitly relating to which Asian groups do well in business. And in fact, they don't do very well because they don't show the qualities of leadership that the society values. And I see this again in my students who come to me, and they see what they think they're supposed to do is to tell me what I think is true. Whereas what I want them to do is come up with a new argument. I value students who take me on, who disagree, who are prepared to make a different argument. It's this quality which the West has, which Asia really doesn't have. That is the capacity to imagine a new world, create a new industry, a new idea. That is what created Silicon Valley and other industries before that. And this is where Asia has a hard time, because although there may be people creative like that in Asia, their presence is a threat to the regime. The regime is highly resistant to any idea of general freedom. And it has to be, given the way it's ruled. And the fact that China really has never accepted any general concordat with the society. Now, Japan is better governed than that, but it's not really a free society in the Western sense. Most people are highly collective-minded. Japanese are not terribly creative in America. So the Asians do very well, but it doesn't mean that they actually have solved their problem with individualism. They really haven't. They avoid the spectacular social problems that we see among the other minorities, but they don't thereby fully assimilate the American system. They have to get beyond Asia. And the ones that do, and I've had students who are, let's say, third generation in this country. Now, they're different. They are, in fact, more fully assimilated. They behave in a more individualist way. they're prepared to argue with them. Whereas those who just came from China are not willing to argue. I mean, I had a class just this past semester where I had Asians of both kinds. One who was native born from a family that had been in China several generations back. Another who just came from Beijing. And the native born Asian was quite willing to argue and debate the issues, and the other one wasn't. And it wasn't lack of ability. It's not about intelligence. It's willingness to get out front to make their own case. And that's where I don't think the Asians have been as remarkable as we like to think. They are, in fact, uniformly successful.
I take it we're just about out of time, but you still haven't answered the question that I posed earlier, and maybe you don't have time to, but what is changing? How do you see the United States changing in the terms of this dichotomy that you emphasize?
I think that the major issue is the extent of immigration. I really do. If it goes on at the current rate, then I think America is going to become more and more Latin and Asian, and it will, in those elements of its society, will not be a particularly Western country any longer. There will still be a large population that did come from Europe, but the future of the culture depends upon whether some in those non-Western groups assimilate the individual's culture, thereby begin to contribute to it. If immigration is cut back, which I hope for, then I think we will be able to assimilate enough of the new groups to maintain the dominant culture. The ideal America that I set out in the book is a culture that is multicultural. We have many different groups, many different traditions, but the individualist temperament remains dominant. That's what we really want to have. That's really the best America.
Go ahead.
Comments?
No, I think I've enjoyed this interchange, and I, as I said at the outset, this is a very, very stimulating book, and it ought to be widely read.
Well, Peter, as you know, you're one of my teachers, particularly about immigration. So I'm very pleased to have you take on this argument as you have, and I'm grateful for that. And the result will be on YouTube in a couple of weeks. We'll get you all on the screen, and you can tell your friends about it.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks very much.